A lonely rancher fed a starving warrior. The next day, 600 natives lined up in silence. The solitary rancher. The empty cabin. The wind howled across the Montana territory like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of another brutal night. February 1887 had been particularly cruel, even by frontier standards. Thomas Grady stood at his frost-covered window, watching the sun die behind the mountains. His reflection stared back, a man of 53 years, face carved by wind and sorrow, gray beard unkempt, eyes that had seen too much. The cabin creaked around him, each sound a reminder of its emptiness. "Another night, Sarah," he whispered to the photograph on the mantel. His wife's image, taken just months before the fever took her, smiled back eternally. 3 years now. 3 years of talking to shadows and memories. He moved to the stove, stirring the perpetual pot of stew that had become his only culinary effort. Beef from his own cattle, potatoes from the root cellar, and onions when he had them. The same meal, every night. It didn't matter. Food was fuel, nothing more. The daily routine outside, his 30 head of cattle huddled together against the barn, their breath creating clouds of steam in the freezing air. Thomas pulled on his heavy coat, wrapped Sarah's old scarf around his neck. It still smelled faintly of her lavender soap, and headed out for the evening check. "Easy, Bessie," he muttered to his lead cow, checking her hooves for ice damage. "We'll make it through another one." The animals were his only companions now. The nearest neighbor, Jim Patterson, lived 8 miles east, and they hadn't spoken since Christmas. The town of Deer Lodge was a 2-day ride in good weather, impossible now with the snow. Thomas had chosen this isolation. After Sarah died, the sympathy of others had felt like salt in an open wound. Better to be alone with honest grief than surrounded by pitying looks. The stranger in the storm. The blizzard arrives. The storm hit without warning just as Thomas was securing the barn door. One moment the air was still. The next, a wall of white descended like a biblical plague. The temperature plummeted so fast his breath froze on his beard. He squinted through the whirling snow, trying to find his way back to the cabin. Only 50 yards, but in this weather, it might as well have been 50 miles. That's when he saw it. A dark shape against the white. Moving wrong. Stumbling. His first thought was a deer, injured and disoriented. But as the figure lurched closer, Thomas realized with a start, it was human. The fallen warrior, the young native man, collapsed 20 feet from the porch, face first into a snowdrift. Thomas didn't hesitate. Sarah would have scolded him for even pausing to think. He rushed forward, his old joints protesting. The man was young, maybe 20 winters. Blood had frozen on his temple, creating a grotesque red ice. His buckskin clothing hung in tatters, as if he'd been dragged through thorns. Or worse. "Lord Almighty," Thomas breathed, checking for signs of life. A pulse, weak but there. The warrior's lips were blue, his exposed skin showing the telltale white patches of severe frostbite. His moccasins were torn, feet exposed to the killing cold. Thomas didn't waste time wondering who he was or why he was here. He hooked his arms under the young man's shoulders and dragged him toward the cabin, grunting with effort. The warrior was lean but solid muscle, heavy as a side of beef. An act of mercy. Warming the frozen inside the cabin, Thomas worked with the efficiency of a man who dealt with frontier emergencies before. He laid the warrior on the rug near the fire, close but not too close. Warming frozen flesh too quickly could kill as surely as the cold itself. "Easy does it," he muttered, carefully removing the torn moccasins. The feet were bad. Another hour and amputation would have been the only option. He filled a basin with lukewarm water, knowing the pain that would come when circulation returned. The warrior stirred, eyes fluttering open. They were as dark as winter nights and filled with confusion. He tried to sit up, hands moving instinctively to where a knife should have been. "Well there, son," Thomas said, hands raised peacefully. "You're safe." Safe. The first meal. The young man's eyes darted around the cabin, taking in every detail, the rifle on the wall, the door locations, and the old rancher's weathered but kind face. Slowly, some of the tension left his shoulders. Thomas ladled stew into a bowl, the rich smell filling the cabin. He set it on the floor near the warrior, then backed away, giving him space. "Eat," he said simply, miming the action. The warrior watched him for a long moment, then reached for the bowl. His hand shook from cold, exhaustion, or perhaps both. The first spoonful seemed to awaken something in him. He ate slowly but steadily, savoring each bite as if it were a feast. Been a while since your last meal, I reckon, Thomas observed. He poured coffee, black and strong, and set that down too. When the bowl was empty, the warrior touched his chest and spoke a single word, Dakota. Thomas understood. He touched his own chest. Thomas. Dakota nodded, the ghost of a smile crossing his battered face. Then, as if the effort of eating had drained his last reserves, his eyes closed, and he slumped back into unconsciousness. The longest night. Vigil by firelight. Thomas covered Dakota with Sarah's quilt, the one she'd made their first winter together. He settled into his chair, rifle across his lap out of habit more than fear. Outside, the blizzard raged like a living thing, rattling windows and howling down the chimney. He studied the young warrior's face in the firelight. Bruises that weren't from cold. Cuts too precise to be accidental. Someone had beaten this boy and left him to die in the storm. What happened to you, son? Thomas whispered. Through the night, he kept watch. Twice, Dakota cried out in his sleep, speaking rapid words in his own language. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone. Fear, anger, grief. He'd made those same sounds himself those first months after Sarah. Memories and ghosts around midnight. Thomas allowed himself to remember. Sarah would have loved this, caring for someone in need. She'd always been the one to take in strays, whether animal or human. Remember that cavalry deserter? He asked her photograph. You hid him in the root cellar for 3 days and fed him from our winter stores. I was so angry and worried about the law. You just smiled and said, Thomas Grady, the only law that matters is written on our hearts. He'd buried her out back, under the oak tree she'd loved. Sometimes he still caught himself setting 2 plates for dinner. The revelation. Dawn of truth. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the world crystalline and new. Thomas had dozed in his chair, but woke when he heard movement. Dakota was sitting up, testing his bandaged feet gingerly. Morning, Thomas said. How are you feeling? Dakota looked at him for a long moment, then spoke in careful, accented English. You saved me. What? Thomas shrugged. Man needs help. You help him. Simple as that. White men, they... Dakota touched his bruised face. They take our horses. Beat me. Leave me to icy death. I'm sorry, Thomas said, meaning it. Not all whites are like that. Just like not all Indians are the same. Dakota studied him. Your woman. Where? Thomas glanced at the photograph. Gone. 3 winters now. Oh. Dakota nodded slowly. You know the empty lodge. The cold that no fire warms. It was Thomas's turn to nod, surprised by the young man's perception. The morning visitor. Thomas rose to tend the animals, leaving Dakota to rest. He opened his door, coffee mug in hand, and stepped onto the porch. The mug slipped from his fingers, shattering on the frozen boards. They filled his entire field of vision. Hundreds upon hundreds of native people, standing in perfect silence across his snow-covered land. Men on horseback formed the front ranks. Behind them, women and children, all wrapped in blankets and furs against the cold. Their breath rose in clouds, but no one spoke. No one moved. Thomas's hand moved instinctively toward the doorframe where his rifle leaned, then stopped. These people weren't here for war. There was no anger in their faces. Only waiting. The reunion. Blood of our blood. Dakota appeared beside him, limping but proud. He raised his hand, and an elderly man on a painted horse rode forward. The elder's face was carved by decades of sun and wind, his silver braids decorated with eagle feathers. This was clearly a chief, a man of great importance. The two spoke in their language, Dakota gesturing toward Thomas. The elder's eyes never left the rancher's face, studying him with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. Finally, Dakota turned to Thomas. This is Chief Joseph White Eagle, my grandfather. They searched for me for 2 days. Think me dead. Your grandfather? Thomas repeated, understanding dawning. He'd saved not just any warrior, but the chief's own blood. The gift of family. Chief White Eagle dismounted with surprising grace for his age. He approached Thomas, reaching into his saddlebag. What he withdrew was a blanket of such beauty that Thomas's breath caught, geometric patterns in red, black, and white, with threads that seemed to capture the morning light. The chief spoke, his voice deep and resonant. Dakota translated, he says, you gave my grandson life. You fed him when he was hungry and warmed him when he was cold. You did this not knowing who he was, asking nothing in return. The Great Spirit smiles on such men. The chief placed the blanket around Thomas's shoulders. It was surprisingly heavy, warm as an embrace. Then, one by one, others came forward. A woman, perhaps Takota's mother, brought a leather pouch filled with pemmican. Children, shy but curious, offered small treasures, a carved wooden horse, a string of blue beads, and a small drum. Warriors brought tools, a finely crafted knife and arrows straight as sunlight. The promised Thomas stood overwhelmed as the gifts piled at his feet. Tears, the first since Sarah's funeral, tracked down his weathered cheeks. I can't. Takota placed a hand on his shoulder. You fed our blood. Now we protect yours. This is the way. Chief White Eagle spoke again, longer this time. Takota translated. My grandfather says you live alone, like a wolf separated from its pack. This is not good. No man should face the winter without family. He offers you a place with us, not to leave your land, but to share it. We will camp at the eastern edge, help with your cattle, and share our haunts. You will share your knowledge of this land and your tools. Together, we survive. Together, we are strong. Thomas looked out at the sea of faces, old warriors scarred by battles, young mothers holding babies, children peeking out from behind their parents, and youth proud and strong like Takota. A whole community. A family. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. I would be honored. The circle complete as the sun climbed higher, the band began setting up camp at the edge of Thomas's property. The sounds of life, laughter, children playing, dogs barking, the ring of tools on wood filled the air that had been silent for so long. Takota remained to help Thomas understand what was happening. My grandfather says the circle is now complete. Once, his own grandfather was saved by a white trapper during a terrible winter. That man asked nothing and gave everything. My grandfather has waited his whole life to repay that debt. But I didn't do anything special, Thomas protested. Just what any decent person would do. Takota smiled. In these times, decent persons are as rare as summer snow. This is why we honor them. That night, Thomas's cabin was full for the first time in 3 years. Chief White Eagle and the tribal elders sat around his fire, sharing stories translated by Takota. The women had somehow transformed his simple stew into a feast with herbs and roots he'd never tasted. As Thomas looked around at the faces illuminated by firelight, faces that just this morning had been strangers, he felt something he'd thought dead forever. Hope. He caught Takota's eye and raised his coffee mug in a silent toast. The young warrior raised his own cup in return, understanding without words. Sometimes the family you lose is replaced by the family you find. And sometimes, all it takes is one act of kindness to change the course of many lives. Outside, the Montana wind still howled. But inside, there was warmth, laughter, and the sound of a lonely heart learning to beat again. The end. In the hardest winters of our lives, we discover that kindness is the only fire that truly warms, and that family is not always the one we're born to, but sometimes the one that finds us when we need it most.